4 a.m. Chicago, 1,600 federal agents, 20 locations, 800 targets. Let us show you how they did it. The largest cartel raid in the city's history was about to begin.
1,600 federal agents stormed Chicago in Operation Steel Flood, smashing the fortified Zeta stronghold in the city's deadliest gang raid ever.
Chicago is a city built on movement. Rail lines, warehouse districts, endless streams of freight feeding the entire Midwest. But beneath that constant motion, federal agents sensed something else taking shape, something organized, something dangerous. Losses had entered Chicago the same way they expanded across Mexico, silently, with military precision. They weren't a street gang fighting over corners. They were a paramilitary organization forged from former elite soldiers notorious for brutality and disciplined tactics. The FBI had once labeled them a national security threat, not just a drug cartel. Their operations in Chicago blended into the city's logistics network. High-powered rifles moved through freight terminals, later appearing in overseas conflict zones. Money was washed through trucking companies, and narcotics, meth of unusually high purity, heroin, and large-scale fentanyl shipments, flowed through industrial corridors toward the Midwest. For months, investigators saw only fragments, unusual containers, encrypted conversations, sudden bursts of violence near abandoned yards, but there was no clear target. Then came the tip. A confidential informant reported a shipment of military-grade rifles passing through a South Side warehouse. Not pistols, but weapons built for war. If you want more people to see how deep cartel infiltration really goes, hit like now. It helps push this story past the noise. Once the tip reached ICE Homeland Security investigations, the atmosphere inside the Chicago field office shifted. Senior agents recognized the pattern instantly. Military-grade rifles, cartel-level narcotics, and clandestine warehouse activity meant one thing. Los Zetas had embedded themselves deeper than anyone realized. But ICE couldn't handle this alone. The file was elevated to a multi-agency task force within days. FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force stepped in first, not because of drugs, but because LOZAs operated with tactics resembling insurgent groups, layered command structures, encrypted couriers, and violence meant to intimidate entire neighborhoods. ATF joined next, bringing expertise in tracking weapons that vanish into foreign conflicts. Chicago Police Department's Gang Intelligence Unit added the local knowledge, streets, safe houses, and the quiet shifts in territory no federal database could see. If you're still following the investigation, comment Chicago. Every comment signals YouTube that this story matters. For 3 years, the investigation expanded like a shadow map beneath the city. Surveillance teams rotated through rail yards and trucking hubs. Undercover operatives infiltrated repair shops and warehouses suspected of storing Zeta shipments. Wiretaps picked up coded references to long tools, cold engines, and night packages. Language agents later decoded as rifles, drug loads, and cash runs. ATF ballistics confirmed the worst. Several rifles recovered in international conflict zones traced back to purchases made in Illinois, funneled through straw buyers, and pushed into Zeta's hands. DEA chemists analyzed seized narcotics from routine traffic stops across the state. The purity levels were unmistakable. This was Zeta's grade meth, the kind produced in industrial superlabs. Each fragment tightened the noose. What began as a single tip had transformed into a panoramic portrait of a cartel building a logistics hub inside Chicago's warehouse maze. And by late 2024, federal prosecutors agreed. The evidence was strong enough to prepare for something unprecedented. A coordinated strike on a scale Chicago had never seen. Before we step into the raids, tap like. It tells the algorithm this kind of reporting shouldn't stay buried. By the winter of 2024, every agency involved understood what they were facing. LOZAs hadn't simply built a foothold in Chicago. They had carved out an operational hub complete with fortified warehouses, armed lookouts, and a rotating network of couriers trained in counter-surveillance. federal prosecutors made their decision. It was time to act. The operation was named Steel Flood, a reference to the wave of federal agents that would hit the city before dawn. Inside a secured command center on the west side, leaders from ICE, FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, Illinois State Police, and Chicago PD studied a digital map dotted with red markers. Each marker represented a location tied to Zetas operations. Weapons depots, drug processing rooms, stash houses, and 2 warehouses identified as potential command points. In total, 2,000 targets, 1,600 officers were assigned to the strike. The scale rivaled some of the largest federal operations in U.S. history. At 4:42 a.m., the first teams rolled out. Armored vehicles moved south along empty expressways. Helicopters hovered silently over the industrial corridors. Sniper teams climbed rooftops near the south side rail yards. Chicago was still dark, cold, and quiet. The kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. The breach began at 4:58 a.m. at Warehouse 17, located in a windswept trucking district. A SWAT team advanced toward a reinforced steel door. Before they could deploy the ram, a muzzle flash lit up the interior. Losses opened fire first. The sound echoed across the empty lot. Sharp controlled bursts, not the chaotic fire of street gangs. These were trained shooters. Federal agents hit the ground instantly. Snipers on a neighboring rooftop identified 2 silhouettes with rifles behind a stack of pallets. A pair of precision shots ended the threat. Flashbangs detonated. The steel door collapsed. Agents poured inside, shouting commands over the ringing echoes. They found 3 Zetas members pinned behind forklifts, continuing to fire until they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of officers pushing in. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded. At a warehouse near Cicero Avenue, a team intercepted a group of armed guards trying to flee in 2 pickup trucks. The vehicles were boxed in by armored units before a single round could be fired. At a South Chicago row house, agents encountered a barricaded room lined with sandbags, a miniature bunker, but the suspects surrendered once the breaching charge detonated. By 7:10 a.m., the operation reached its peak. Hundreds of arrests, weapons everywhere. Drugs stacked in bulk packaging, ledgers, cash counters, encrypted phones, logistics binders, and most of all, the unmistakable confirmation that Chicago had been the beating heart of a laceless distribution network. The city had just witnessed the largest cartel takedown in its history. If the scale of Steel Flood surprised you, drop Steel Flood below. It boosts the video and keeps the series alive. When the dust settled from the early morning raids, federal agents moved into the second phase of Operation Steel Flood, turning chaos into evidence. Every warehouse, every container, every cell phone, every round of ammunition was now part of a vast criminal map that prosecutors had been waiting years to complete. Inside Warehouse 17, the same location where the first shots of the operation were fired, agents worked methodically. The air still carried the sharp scent of gunpowder. Shell casings were marked in neat yellow triangles. A forklift riddled with rifle fire was cordoned off as evidence. Beneath a false pallet wall, investigators uncovered a cache of rifles wrapped in military-grade oilcloth. Each one stamped with serial numbers already filed off. ATF ballistic specialists recognized the model immediately. A rifle previously traced to conflict zones overseas. It was the first direct confirmation that Chicago was not just a distribution hub. It was a weapons pipeline. At another target on the south side, agents discovered a small fortified room resembling a command cell. Maps of freight routes were pinned across a corkboard. Colored strings connected ports in Texas to rail hubs in Illinois. Encrypted tablets lay scattered across a steel desk, still logged into messaging channels that displayed Zetas insignia. The room looked less like a gang hideout and more like a forward operating post. Meanwhile, at a property on Ashland Avenue, a secondary confrontation unfolded. A team of U.S. Marshals breached a two-story home believed to be a stash point for cash and narcotics. As they entered, ICE's lieutenant attempted to flee through the back stairwell, firing blindly down the hall. A deputy returned fire with 2 controlled shots, wounding him in the leg. The rest of the occupants surrendered immediately. On the second floor, agents found steel lockboxes filled with rubber-banded currency along with torn notebooks detailing payouts, bribes, and shipments. Piece by piece, the organization's structure emerged. Informants who agreed to cooperate provided the missing layers. A 3-tier hierarchy mirroring military doctrine, quartermasters managing weapons and ammunition, logistics crews embedded in trucking companies, a financial wing laundering millions through freight brokers, and a Chicago-based plaza boss reporting directly to Zetas commanders in Mexico. Federal prosecutors spent hours stitching every thread together. ATF matched dozens of rifles to seizures made overseas. DEA determined the meth recovered in Chicago came from a single superlab network across the border. FBI analysts decrypted conversations that outlined the cartel's plans to expand distribution from Illinois into Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Ohio. By the end of the week, the evidence filled an entire federal warehouse. The charges were devastating. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, international firearms trafficking, money laundering, violent crimes, and aid of racketeering. Some defendants faced mandatory minimums. Others, particularly those tied to weapons proliferation, faced life in federal prison. What began as scattered intelligence had hardened into an impenetrable case file. One strong enough to bring a paramilitary cartel network to its knees inside one of America's largest cities. Chicago had seen the battle. Now it would see the consequences. In the hours following Operation Steel Flood, Chicago entered a strange silence. The kind that settles over a city after a storm no one fully understood until it passed. Police radios crackled non-stop. Federal convoys rolled through industrial corridors. Helicopters traced slow circles above the south side. But for the first time in years, the movement was controlled, orderly, no longer dictated by Los Zetas. Yet the operation wasn't over. Inside the command center, agents monitored heat signatures and drone footage from the remaining target zones. Not all Zetas members had been captured in the initial raids. Some had scattered into alleyways and abandoned yards when the first doors were breached. Others attempted to regroup, a familiar tactic used by the cartel during conflicts in Mexico. They sought high ground, rooftops, vantage points that offered a chance to strike back or escape. One such confrontation unfolded near an old grain terminal along the Calumet River. A rapid response team from ICE and ATF tracked movement inside the upper floors of the derelict structure. Thermal imaging revealed 2 armed suspects hiding behind rusted machinery. As the team advanced, the suspects opened fire from above, bullets punching sparks from the metal beams. Agents used the concrete silos as cover, returning steady, disciplined fire. It lasted less than 40 seconds, but the exchange was fierce. A reminder that Losses was not a gang accustomed to surrender. Once the suspects were secured, the final sweep began. Federal agents spent the next 48 hours cataloging what remained. Hidden basements used as microprocessing labs. Vacuum-sealed fentanyl bricks marked with Zetas emblems. Storage lockers containing rifle parts and tactical gear. Ledgers showing payments to couriers stretched across 5 states. Chicago's leadership held a joint press conference at City Hall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, federal, state, and local, emphasizing that this was not just a victory, but a warning. Losses had attempted to carve out a military-style foothold inside one of America's major logistics capitals, and they had nearly succeeded. Across the neighborhoods most deeply affected, residents stepped outside to watch convoy trucks disappear down the streets that had once been battlegrounds of intimidation. Some had lived for years with the sound of unmarked vehicles at night, the coded exchanges near loading docks, the unspoken understanding that certain blocks simply belonged to someone else. Now, for the first time, there was a sense, cautious but real, that control was being restored. But no one celebrated because Chicago understood what federal commanders understood. Removing 600 Zetas members created a vacuum. Power voids attract predators. Smaller gangs might attempt to rise. International cartels might try to reclaim lost territory. Federal agencies announced they would maintain a long-term presence, reinforcing CPD with intelligence teams and patrol units. Community groups mobilized, too. Youth programs, re-entry initiatives, job pipelines, efforts designed to keep vulnerable young men from becoming the next generation of cartel recruits. In the end, Operation Steel Flood did more than dismantle a cartel network. It exposed how close Chicago had come to becoming a permanent node in an international paramilitary empire. The battle had been fought. The city had endured it. What came next would define whether the victory truly lasted. In the end, Operation Steel Flood wasn't just a raid. It was a lesson. A reminder that even in one of America's largest, fastest-moving cities, danger can grow quietly in the shadows of the systems we depend on. Chicago's rail lines, trucking hubs, and industrial corridors kept the Midwest alive. But they also became the lanes cartels tried to exploit. What stopped them wasn't luck. It was the discipline, precision, and sacrifice of U.S. federal agents. ICE, HSI, FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, Illinois State Police, and Chicago PD, men and women who ran toward fortified warehouses before dawn, knowing exactly who they were up against. America's front line isn't overseas. Many times it's right here at home. And these teams proved again why the United States remains one of the most capable law enforcement forces on Earth. But this victory carries a warning. Power vacuums attract new predators. And the only way to stop the next network from rising is awareness. People like you paying attention, speaking up, and refusing to let these stories disappear. So if you believe this truth matters, hit like, drop a comment, and share this video. Your voice pushes it further and it honors the agents who risk everything to keep America safe.